So just how different is the first generation Mini from the current generation Mini? Let's find out. So in today's video, I have the R50 that you saw in the previous video, and I have my F56 that you've seen in quite a few videos. And I thought it'd be fun to show you what is different between the two cars and what has kind of stayed the same over the generations. For starters, yes, the R50 is smaller than the F56, but if you look closely enough, and I've done the checking, the roof height is actually about the same. What has gotten smaller though is the greenhouse. As the windshield on the F56 raked out more than the R50, and you can see how almost vertical the R50 windshield is, they made the greenhouse area smaller on the newer generations. So the result is shorter window height, shorter windshield height, but the windshield's brought out further. When those changes are done, the result is the cars are the same height, but you can definitely see how the greenhouse area, and for those of you who don't know what a greenhouse is, it's all the windows around the car. You'll notice how similar in height the two cars are, but how much shorter the greenhouse on the F56 is. And it's quite noticeable, more so when you get to the belt line. You'll also notice, and this changed on the second generation cars too, the cowl area where the wipers are attached was exposed on the first generation Minis. Second generation and third generation, they went to a concealed wiper arms and a concealed cowl area, so not quite as exposed as the first gens. As far as door handles go, R50 door handle, F56 door handle. While the door handles look very similar in styling, they obviously have gotten bigger on the current cars, and while on the old cars you had to press and pull, on the newer ones the handle is one piece and there's no press. You pull and the door opens. Wheels and tires. Now there's the funny thing. Wheel and tire sizes between the two generations have not changed. You can still get 17x7s on the F56 and 18x7s, which you could also get on the R50. The only difference is F56 wheels will not fit on the R50, but R56 wheels will fit on the R50, and R50 wheels will fit on the R56, so give and take right there. Scuttles. First generation, second generation, and third generation all have side scuttles. The difference is, while the first generation was a physical vent, the third generation moved to more of a decorative plate with a turn signal repeater and some decorative trim. So while it became decorative on the third gens, it was decorative on the first gens, but it had a more functional look to it with the physical vents in there as well. As far as the mirrors go, first generation, second generation, and third generation pre-LCI 2 had a oval shaped mirror. This obviously changed on the third generation LCI 2, and apologies for the bug splatter, but I do drive my car every single day. They went to a more almost squared off angular look to it, kind of hinting at what was to come with the fourth generation, but they did do some changes to kind of take away a little bit of the ovalness of the mirrors. As far as both cars go, they both have a chrome belt line. Granted, mine is blacked out right now, but the belt line has continued through all three generations of the Mini Cooper, and it's continuing even into the fourth generation, although I believe it's going to be blacked out instead of chrome this time. Those things have continued, along with headlight trim rings. Now granted, they were integral to the headlight on the first gens. They were removable on the second gen so you could change them out, and on the third gens and even the fourth gens, they are removable as well. Another commonality between the two cars has been the continuation of the black plastic wheel arch trims. Now, first, second, and third generations, I have seen third generations where they've painted them. First and second generations, you could even get them as an accessory at one point, and you could get them painted. They look cool, but they look a little too much like the electric Mini Cooper for my liking. So I've always been a fan of the plastic wheel arches. Now, the reason behind that is if I get one scuffed, it's a lot easier to replace than an entire fender. Headlights. Now, the halogens were commonplace through the first generation, second generation, and most of the third generation before they went strictly to LED. Now, first generation, second generation had xenon headlights. These are actually replicas, so they do not have a functional xenon beam up here. They do have the style of the xenons, and this continued through the first generation, second generation, but they moved to LED when they went to the third. However, they still managed to keep the shape of the headlights from the previous generation, so there is some continuity between the two cars. Dual panel sunroofs. are commonplace on all generations of the Mini, and in this one it's no exception. First generation, second generation, the same ones basically. Obviously redesigned, but the styling is the same for the most part. The first generation, the panel on the front popped up and then would slide back. The second generation, both panels would pop up, but only the front panel would slide back. Third generation, they went back to the front panel popping up and sliding back, but the rear panel stays fixed. And I think it had to do with the fact that the second generations, the rear panel that popped up tended to rattle. So, got to get rid of the rattle somehow. Now, this Cooper does have a Cooper S spoiler, but my JCW obviously has a JCW spoiler. But spoilers have been a thing that's been very commonplace on every single Mini from Gen 1 to Gen 3. Bet you didn't know that. First generation didn't quite have that problem. Aesthetically, from the rear of the vehicle, they look very similar in style. The traditional taillights, the boot handle, rear bumper. You come over to the third generation and very similar again. Granted, that one has aftermarket Union Jack taillights, but you have the taillights, you have the boot handle. Everything is very similar in styling, just a bit more updated. Now, some eagle-eyed viewers out there did notice this. This car is running R56 side skirts. Now, you might be wondering why that's the case. Well, it's because the R56 was actually a facelift of the R50. So some of these parts supposedly fit between the two cars. So naturally those would actually attach perfectly, but you can definitely tell these are R56 side skirts because the wheel arches are smaller on the first gens, but they got bigger on the second gens. Neat detail though. Third generation, they ditched the vent entirely on the skirt. Now the reason why this does not bother me that much is because my JCW Clubman, and this is how you can tell a true JCW Clubman, did not have a vent on the back of the side skirt. It had something very identical to this, which is more of a aero fairing, if you will, for lack of a better term. Now before I dive into the engine, I did want to point this out. This is the C-pillar on the F56. There should be a C-pillar, but this is the C-pillar of the R50. Now you'll notice the window glass comes around and curves around the back corner. It doesn't do that on the second gen or the third gen. And the reason why had something to do with manufacturing, because this curved glass is quite expensive and hard to replace if you break it. Like if you shatter it like right here, you really don't want to do that. It could happen. And this car is also incredibly dusty. It's been sitting outside. Whereas they fixed that problem by having a standard window with a C-pillar trim. But for the longest time, this was a very sleek aesthetic for the first generation Minis. And it really created the floating, if you will, roof on these cars. You're looking at this and you're seeing exactly what the design aesthetic was supposed to have. This floating roof here with the glass and then the body of the car bisected by a chrome belt line. Engines. Let's dive into the engines. The R50 uses the W10, which is about 116 to 120 horsepower, naturally aspirated. Second generation used the 1.6 liter Prince motor, which was naturally aspirated unless you got the turbo, because it went from a supercharged to a turbocharged. Third generation, exclusively turbo. Even the Cooper had a turbocharged engine. Now, you look at the engine bays, and this one looks incredibly full of equipment. And this one looks very, very sparse. Very easy to find things, very easy to reach things. Like I can get to my engine mount right there. I can't see my engine mount right here. You also could do things with the first gens that you can't do with the third gens. For one, you could put really cool eyes right here, the eye decals, if everyone remembers those. And you can't do that with the third gens. That's because that's where the headlights are. You may not know this. The headlights on the first gens were fixed into the bonnet, whereas second and third gens, they were attached to the body with a cutout in the bonnet. Why is that? It all has to do with laws regarding lights in movable body panels. There's a reason why the first model years of the F54 Clubman had its brake lights in the rear bumper. It's because in the US you cannot have functioning lights, brake lights, tail lights, headlights in movable body panels. So to fix that on the Clubman at least, they had to put the tail lights, the brake lights at least, in the bumper. Now they did fix it later to where the brake lights would be in the doors, but when you open the doors, it would shift the lights to the bumper. Now in this case, headlights were in the bonnet, not attached to the body. They didn't like that because if the bonnet were ever removed from the vehicle, you now have no headlights. So there you go. That is why the headlights are attached to the body of the car. Fun fact, by the way, if you ever got into a wreck there's these screw mounts right here on the headlights. That's so that if these tabs get broken, they can put a tab on here to reattach the headlight. So they can effectively screw the headlight back on by attaching new brackets after an accident. So kind of a cool thing. So you can always tell if a headlight's been replaced on your Mini because these screw holes are used instead of the tabs. There's definitely some simplicity to the first generation car, and you can see it firsthand here. I mean, look at this. Very, very basic. Coil pack right here instead of individual coils, which if I pop that cover, you would see individual coils there. But very, very different. This is very minimal, as it were. Very tidy, very organized. I mean, it's organized over here, but you can actually reach everything in this engine. I would have to take panels off to get to stuff in this engine. So I kind of like this engine better, which is saying something. And it has a dipstick, which the third gens do not, as you can plainly see. As far as closing the bonnet, as I just did over here, as far as closing the bonnet, both of them are the same way. Bring it down, drop. Don't need to throw it, don't need to press it, don't need to do anything like that, because you can still dent this. It's not very thick steel, so you don't want to mess with that. As far as the interior goes, that's where things are a little different, obviously. You come into the first generation Mini, and you're greeted by, in this case, a twin spoke steering wheel with the tack mounted right here. You have your speedometer right here, you have your radio with CD player right here, and you have your climate control down here with all of your toggle switches, your shifter, your heated seats, and your mirror adjustment. Everything is symmetrically mounted. Your hood release, or bonnet release, is over there on the passenger side, because in the UK, that's the driver's side. Everything is where it needs to be. Now let me show you the third gen. Now climbing into the third gen, and I apologize for the cleanliness of my car, you're greeted by a 3-spoke steering wheel, a electronic digital instrument binnacle here, and a center screen where the first gen had a speedometer. The styling aesthetic is still very, very much similar between the two cars. They still look very similar, but this has somewhat more of a refined, almost BMW quality to it, whereas the first generation has a very raw, almost go-kart quality to it. Almost, I wouldn't say kit car, but very close to being bare bones. And for a lot of people out there, that's what they liked about it. That's why the first generations are so popular. That's why even the second generation is so popular. Third generations are popular because they're refined, they're fun to drive still, and they have a lot of tech in them. But the first generations made do with very little tech, and that was the whole point of the car, is it was just a fun to drive little hatchback that happened to get incredible fuel economy and looked good doing it. And the third generation Minis do that as well. They are great cars to drive. They have a lot more technology in them than the first gens, obviously. But overall, they're very, very similar in their styling cues. The third generation still harkens back to the first generation. You can still instantly tell that this is a Mini and that's a Mini. The styling has evolved over time, but the two cars really do have a common lineage. And when you look at the face of the R50, you see the classic Mini from the days of the Italian Job and Paddy Hopkirk and rally racing. And then when you go and look at the front of the F car, you see the same thing. There's that traditional round headlighted face that you all know as the original Mini, except this one has a slightly bigger grille that even harkens back to the classic Minis. Now what's funny is if you look at the R50 carefully with the JCW bumper on it, and you look at that upper grille and then look at the one in the bumper, does that look familiar to you? You'd be correct. Look at the styling, follow the lines, follow where it goes around, follow where it comes down, and now look at the new car. Pretty much the same shape. I find them all equally incredibly fun to drive. Now the question I have for you all then, at this point, you've now seen the R50, you've seen the F56. You obviously have a preference out there. Which one do you like?